discussing their book, Get on the Job and Organize, with their friend and mentor, Richard Bensinger. Jaz Brisack offers an inside look at today's resurgent and much-needed labor movement in Get on the Job and Organize. From Starbucks to Tesla, Brisack chronicles workers' bold campaigns to unionize in the face of powerful corporate resistance. Drawing from their firsthand experience as a Rhodes Scholar-turned-barista who helped launch Starbucks Workers United, Brisack weaves a vivid narrative of solidarity, strategy, and the fight for a more just workplace and world. Richard Bensinger is the former organizing director of the national AFL-CIO and the United Auto Workers, and the founder of the AFL-CIO Organizing Institute, which prioritized recruiting women, people of color, and young people in the labor movement. He currently works with Workers United, where he helped launch the Starbucks campaign in Buffalo, New York, and he teaches organizing at the Inside Organizer School. Please join me in welcoming both of them to the book festival and to this tent.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks to our moderator. Thanks for coming. I'm glad to see you all. So I think the framing of this is that I'm going to interview Jaz for 25 or 30 minutes and then a Q&A after that. Right? And to put this in context, at the peak, the labor movement had 40% union density in the private sector in the United States, 40%, just about 40. Today, it's dropped to 5.8%. And if you track the decline of unions downward, and track the increase in income inequality, they parallel. And so maybe there's a lot of problems. Everybody can have their own solutions to income inequality, but unless a resurgent labor movement is part of that, it's hard to understand how you're going to really resolve all of that. So with that, I'm going to ask you about your background. But first, I think it'd be appropriate. I brought surprise for Jaz. Come on. You got to put...
I will not. I'm not putting it on. No. No. You're going to get decaf the next time I make you coffee, which is the barista form of rebellion against unruly customers who may have it coming. So it's surreal to be here. I met Richard when I was 18 years old at the University of Mississippi. You were in Mississippi working on the Nissan campaign to try to help workers at the 6,000-person plant in Canton organize. And I didn't really know unions still existed, but I was a big history nerd, and I'd learned about unions in this roundabout accidental path where, I had become an atheist and then gotten into the Scopes Monkey trial, learned about Clarence Darrow, and Clarence Darrow spoke very highly of Eugene Debs. And so that put me on this path of reading about while there is a lower class, I am in it, while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. And then I met Richard, and I think in some ways when you're first learning organizing, you imprint on the first organizer that you meet like a little baby bird. And that was Richard. And I got really lucky because I could have imprinted on all kinds of organizers, some of whom the labor movement has terms for, like pie cards and pork choppers. And Richard was truly a reincarnation of Eugene Debs, very much motivated by the fight to build a better world and not bogged down in, keep flapping, very much not bogged down in, the politics of the labor movement. Just want to say, too, before I get into your actual question, how amazing it is to be here with so many incredible folks, like Barbara Phillips, who was one of the first activists that sort of adopted me in Mississippi and helped steer me in many great directions, and Ginny Diamond, who I got to know when we were starting the Inside Organizer School, and who's one of the most genius, level-headed morale people of the labor movement. So anyway, amazing to be here. And my background, I think part of the reason I wanted to write the book is because I wanted more people to understand, if they could do it, we can do it, both on a institutional or like a company-wide level. If we could organize Starbucks, anybody can organize their workplace. But also on, I'm not a red diaper baby. I didn't grow up knowing that unions existed. My dad is an immigrant from India who worked in, the tech sector and marketing. And my mom was a Southern populist for good and often for bad. And so, I had a weird trajectory to coming to labor history and coming to an understanding that this was what I wanted to do. And the reason that I still am in love with labor organizing, despite a lot of the obstacles of it, both from companies and sometimes also from unions, is that I think the labor movement has a unique power to unite all of the other issues that we care about. And, you can't have liberation on all these other issues without actually giving people self-determination through economic freedom.
So with this decline I was talking about, what's incredible is there's this bright spot. There's this generational uprising that Starbucks started, a sort of new wave of union organizing across the country, and it's led by people. For me, it's incredible. Like, I died and gone to heaven. It's like the 1930s probably, but 90% of young people are now in favor of unions. And Jaz is probably the chief spokesperson of that generation. So can you explain to us, sort of your perspective, what the world of union organizing is like? Why is it so hard? What are the obstacles? And maybe use Starbucks as an example.
Yeah, for sure. We will have time.
She won't talk about the Rhodes Scholarship.
We'll have time for questions later on.
We forced her to go do it. She didn't want to do it. They forced them to go do it. They didn't want to do it. And then they cut the second year to come organize Starbucks.
So why is it so hard to organize a union, to your question? I think I'm going to start with Nissan, and we'll get to Starbucks in 1 second. But Nissan was my first rodeo. And after we lost the campaign, a lot of people were like, well, what did you expect? You were trying to organize in Mississippi. And I think there are a lot of parallels between what happened at Nissan and what happened at Starbucks. And, obviously, the politicians in Mississippi were more hostile than the politicians in New York in most cases. But what companies do to fight unions is boilerplate. And, they've written books, they have formulas, they develop those formulas, and they have, this billion-dollar union-busting industry in the U.S., where Starbucks and Nissan had the same exact union-busting law firm, and in fact, some of the same exact lawyers working on both cases. And so that might have taken slightly different forms, but they were doing very similar things. And so at Nissan, that took the form of constant anti-union meetings, a barrage of anti-union messages, threats about the plant closing, and trying to keep workers, more afraid of what might happen if they unionized than of what was happening to them without a union, including workers dying on the shop floor. And so I learned, that organizing a union is often truly a life and death matter for workers, and without a union, people have no way of advocating for the things that could change their lives and also transform their lives. But at Starbucks, we were kind of naive going into this. I think on some level, especially Richard, thought that Starbucks might actually live up to what they said they believed. They marketed themselves as a different kind of company, a progressive company. They'd spent, years trying to promote this image of themselves as a progressive, a safe space for LGBTQ people. After a very racist incident in a Pennsylvania store, they closed down all the stores across the country to do training of the managers on, how to be less racist or anti-racist, they would probably have said. But what we saw very quickly after launching the campaign was, a very typical onslaught of anti-union behavior. They closed one store, they closed another store indefinitely and turned it into a training store. They sent in what they called a SWAT team of executives and managers led by the president of Starbucks North America, who is, in our stores, running the trash, sweeping the lobby, and pulling workers off the floor who, recognized her from the training videos that everybody had to take. And to some of the longer term people, they were like, oh my God, they want to listen to me. But it was this very manipulative psychological attack. And one of our original organizing committee members who suffered from mental health issues ended up dying by suicide after months of Starbucks bullying her, refusing to let her transfer to other stores or transfer back to Buffalo, hounding her. When we lost the vote at her store, we filed for 3 votes. We won my store on the day. Another one we won eventually, but they had packed the bargaining unit with workers from other stores who didn't work there, and then we lost one. Workers were physically sick. So I think that really showed the psychological toll that union busting can take on people, where people were suddenly being written up for things that they'd never done before. They were being scheduled to close the store one night and come in and open the next morning, meaning that you couldn't get enough sleep. They were, if you wanted more hours, you would get your hours slashed. If you wanted fewer hours, you would get scheduled, all the time. It was very much a psychological war. And they did things like, Starbucks had a history of hiring disproportionately white workers into a lot of the stores, especially in Buffalo. And as a result, our organizing committee was disproportionate, or was largely white and white passing. And so they hired mainly black workers into our stores and then tried to tell them not to trust the organizing committee because the organizing committee was very white. And we, I think, made a lot of outreach to these new hires. And we were also really lucky that people like Cortland, who was one of the new hires at my store, had applied to Starbucks because he wanted to be part of the union and wanted to help advance the campaign. And they didn't know that. So that was incredibly helpful. But it was the inverse of what Littler Mendelsohn and Nissan had done, which was telling workers, at Nissan that, the white workers, that they didn't want to be part of a majority black union. Instead, they were trying to flip that script, but still split people along these same lines at Starbucks. So anyway, all of that to say, they have a formula. It's an incredibly insidious, very racist, very unjust formula, but it's incredibly effective.
When Starbucks came to Buffalo, they brought 150 managers in to do it, led by the president of Starbucks North America, who never left Buffalo for 4 months. She has over 15,000 stores in all over North America. They closed stores, and they did all this stuff. But there's a law, right? The National Labor Relations Act. So what's the story with that?
Well, there is a law, and it works pretty much exactly how it's intended to work, which is in the company's best interests. I think Richard has a name for the National Labor Relations Board, which is the No Labor Rights Board, because companies have every incentive, the way the law currently is, to break the law first and ask questions later. Under U.S. labor law, there's no penalties for firing workers, closing stores, denying people the very benefits that they're asking for at the bargaining table, but giving those to all the non-union workers to try to prevent people from unionizing. And so when these things were all done at Starbucks, they've been done at Amazon and Trader Joe's and all these other companies that are copying that same playbook. And we're still, I was fired by Starbucks in retaliation for organizing, and my case is still pending litigation. Now it's probably going to go to the Trump board and not fare very well. But even under, quote unquote, the most pro-union president, we had no real, means of getting relief from the law. I think, the court of public opinion has a lot of power in terms of, the potential to hold companies accountable. But yeah, the No Labor Rights Board continues.
And when Jaz was fired, the NLRB in the region found merit after a 1-year investigation, and they charged the company with breaking the law. But they won that case. Then it was litigated, and they were prosecuted by the federal government. They won that case. But it goes on. It can go on for years and years and years. And the goal is to keep the union out and scare Jaz's coworkers.
But it's also very politicized, and oftentimes, I think after Elon Musk started suing the National Labor Relations Board to try to get it ruled unconstitutional, they started being afraid of, prosecuting companies the way that they deserve. So we had a campaign at Tesla in Buffalo where the day after workers went public with their union campaign on Valentine's Day, with all of this momentum, workers, we leafleted the plant and workers were cheering and like, where has this union been? This is the greatest thing ever. And Elon Musk fired 40 workers allegedly for performance issues who had been told that, never been told they were doing anything wrong. Many of them had been told that they were doing great. And they were, they hadn't seen these reviews. And in many ways, this was the exact playbook that Elon would implement, at Doge a few months later or a year later. But the NLRB let Elon get away with that. And whether that was because there wasn't enough public pressure on the board to make them do the right thing, or whether that was because they were scared of what Elon Musk might do, who can say. But at Starbucks, I think we got better than usual treatment from the board. And of course, it's still not enough to actually win the right to organize.
One more thing about being, even though you're terminated, you're still an employee of Starbucks, which means
That's why you brought the apron.
Exactly, because I'm not allowed to wear it. I'm not allowed to wear it. Howard Schultz, the founder, would kill me. And so you are allowed to wear it still. At least he would allege you're not, but we believe the NLRB would find you are.
Still not doing it.
All right. So I kept trying. No, well, back pay is tolling, but for each day that they're not reinstated. So if they win after 6 years of appeal, I was fired. It took me 6 years to win my job back 100 years ago. But and remember that it's not. They weren't trying to they were trying to scare take the leader and and get rid of them. Howard Schultz was testifying at the Bernie Sanders Help Committee, Education and Labor Committee at the U.S. Senate a year and a half or two ago. And he spoke about Jaz, who we've always said Jaz lives inside Howard's head. And could you tell us what he called you and why he called you that? And a tough question, what would you say to Howard if he was sitting here?
Well, what Howard said was, he was asked a softball question by one of the Republicans on the committee about salting. Salting is the practice of getting a job with the goal of organizing it. And it's a tactic that the labor movement has used forever, especially in the time before there was really the sharp distinction between staff organizers and worker organizers, because most organizers were working in the places that they were organizing and people were getting jobs and unionizing them. And that was how, all kinds of unions, whether it was the Wobblies, getting jobs on specific agricultural campaigns they wanted to work on, or mine workers, or, people like Walter Reuther getting jobs in auto plants and helping organize the UAW. And so I had been organizing on the Nissan campaign, on Spot Coffee and other union campaigns as an outside organizer. I'd started working with Richard and Ginny and the collective at the Inside Organizer School to teach people and recruit folks to become inside organizers, but I hadn't had that experience of organizing my own workplace. And so I thought, both it was the most effective way to organize Starbucks. I'd been working with a worker named Benny in Buffalo who got fired allegedly because they were cursing at work, but they'd had about 20 conversations with their coworkers about trying to form a union. And I can tell you, if Starbucks fired workers for cussing on the job, they would have no workers, because that is a requisite. In fact, I tried not to cuss when I got hired, and everybody thought I was a goody-goody, so I had to start cussing in order to gain people's trust. But also because I wanted to learn what it was like to organize from the inside. And so what I would say to Howard is, people have every right to get a job and organize it. And in fact, if you have a job, you should have a union. And Howard took it very personally. He had taken over as CEO of Starbucks in the 80s, and he made it his mission to decertify the union at the few stores in Seattle. They didn't have very many stores yet. So the few stores in Seattle and the roastery had a union. And Howard, made it his goal to get rid of that union, successfully, encouraged workers to vote it out, and had spent the next 50 years keeping unions out of Starbucks. And, everybody had a story about somebody who had tried to bring it up and often got fired or pushed out of the company. And so up against that background, it was incredibly difficult to organize. But what I would have said to Howard was, stop taking this so personally. It's not a why me situation. It's not that you're doing, because he kept saying, I'm not bad, I'm good, I give you all these great things. In fact, he flew to Buffalo at the height of the union campaign to give the last anti-union speech before we were going to vote. And this speech was about how he had grown up poor. He had the shame and the scars from being poor, which of course he was saying to a room of poor people who were not ashamed of being poor. And then he talked about, how he wanted to build a company that his dad hadn't had a chance to work at. And he gave us free Spotify and tuition waivers at Arizona State University and beanstalk in the company. And then he talked about the Holocaust and how prisoners in Auschwitz had shared their blankets with each other when the Nazis didn't give them enough blankets, and how that was what he was doing at Starbucks, was sharing his blanket. And that went over so poorly that we were signing people up on union cards during the speech who had not ever wanted to be publicly for the union. So the boss is often the best organizer, and I would have thanked Howard for his service to the union by talking about the Holocaust.
I was outside the Hyatt Regency in Buffalo when they were giving their speech, and everybody came out afterwards and they were saying, he talked about the Holocaust. You go, what? He talked about the what? So it was really sort of, but thank you, Howard. Why do you think the younger generation is so? When I was standing here yesterday, somebody said, I like your T-shirt. I wear my union T-shirts on flights everywhere, and people are always saying, that's a cool shirt. It's actually a shirt that Jaz designed. And a young person, of course, said, I like your T-shirt. It was actually it was Oliver, your son, Sue Ellen and Billy Lasser's son. And so why is it that unions are so popular, 90% popular? Why? With your people under 30?
Well, I think we are in a moment similar to the 30s when people, with the CIO and other unions were getting jobs and organizing them from underground, where there's nothing else that's going to save us. And I think there's a growing understanding that, if you want a quality of living that's even comparable to your parents' generation, let alone, an attainable life or the possibility of retirement, or, Starbucks workers are 70% women, and those of us who do not identify as women are mostly, trans and queer and non-binary. And if you want a world where, you could have, reproductive freedom, where you could have safety as a trans person, where you could have a future, with climate, all of these causes, if you want to take action on any struggle, all of these things come down to actually having, the ability to negotiate against capital and to take down the capitalist systems that are responsible for all of this combined oppression. And so I think young people aren't organizing a union just to get, better pay or, retirement. I don't think most people even necessarily believe we're going to see retirement ourselves, but in order to actually exercise democracy and start changing what a workplace is like, because without a union, it is a dictatorship. And I don't mean that in a rhetorical way. I mean, workers have no say over any of the conditions that they're living and working in. And with a union, people actually can start to experience democracy, can organize around a variety of causes, and can start taking action on things. And that's why, I think one of the most important things that we did at Starbucks Workers United was speak out in solidarity with Palestine. And a lot of folks at the time were like, well, what are you doing? And we were like, well, this is, a union where workers are speaking their minds on everything. We didn't have a comms firm telling us what our tweets should say. We had workers, tweeting stuff. And so we had taken stances, on all kinds of things, whether it was trans rights or whether it was racial justice and kicking cop unions out of our labor federations and all these various topics. And people were like, well, okay, that affects your members. And we were like, well, so does Solidarity with Palestine. Our members are 97% on board with taking this stand because it ended up going to a vote of the rank and file. And I think that has been replicated in a lot of different unions where people don't see organizing as just about, the direct wages and benefits and working conditions that you're dealing with, but actually as this force to transform society and to have a voice against all of these things that feel, too powerful and too big to take on.
So we have about 20 minutes left in the 45-minute program. So let me ask you one more question, and then let's take questions from the audience. So where are you going? What are you up to next? What are you doing with your life?
We'll get more into things, but I think I'm doing a couple of things right now. The main one is trying to expand the Inside Organizer School, which has grown from this all-volunteer collective that we put together to try to teach people how to organize their own workplaces, which was the foundation of the Starbucks campaign. I learned about how to organize there. We recruited 10 folks who got jobs in Starbucks in Buffalo who learned about, how to organize, how to identify who you should be talking to, how to keep a campaign secret until you were ready to go public so that you didn't give the boss ammunition too early in the process. And we're trying to expand that, geographically to have trainings all across the country, including in the South and the Midwest and a lot of places that people don't think are the typical usual suspects for union organizing, to expand the different sectors that we're doing this in. I think to recruit people who want to be involved in the labor movement but have no idea how to get started and need, the backing and the advice to be able to have a successful campaign. Because I think there's often a dichotomy where people are like, organizing is either grassroots and worker to worker, or, it's top down and staff heavy. And I think, the Starbucks campaign, when we started, only had 2 staff organizers working on it, me and Richard, and I was working at Starbucks. So you don't need a preponderance of staff, but you need people like Richard with 50 years of experience who know how to actually hold a company accountable. And I think folks like my friends at Chipotle and Amazon, don't have that same commitment, don't have a union that's bringing that same commitment to bringing down the hammer and, holding the companies that have been putting them through hell accountable for that. And so, Richard always starts the Inside Organizer schools by saying you need 2 things to win. You need a representative and diverse organizing committee of the workers in your workplace, and you need a hammer. And so that's what we're trying to build and develop. And then I'm also doing some work on individual union campaigns because I realized about a year into trying to work just on the Inside Organizer School that I'm addicted to being on union campaigns and directly helping workers organize. And so I'm helping the UFCW set up some grocery store campaigns in California right now.
Okay. And on the book, what would you like to know?
We have microphones for questions.
Oh, yeah. Okay. First of all, you're not getting away without answering the Rhodes Scholar question, so I'll just stand here till you make up your mind. Go.
Well, I went to do the Rhodes Scholarship in the end after really wanting to not go. I was working on organizing campaigns like Spot Coffee that were incredibly exciting, largely because Jenny Diamond said, if Gramsci could go to prison, you can go to Oxford. And so I stuck it out for a brief time, did not have the best experience, did meet some really cool people. But I think looking back, I'm glad I did that because it helped in a lot of ways get more attention to the Starbucks campaign. And I think we're going to have to do something about the celebrity unionism issues. But, while we have that system, then maybe we should use it. So.
Did you study union history at Oxford?
I did. I wrote about the Wobblies and the Little Red Songbook, which was their propaganda machine for reaching people who wouldn't necessarily read, thick books of theory.
And how long were you there altogether?
1 year.
Okay. Now, my father was a union leader in the 1940s. The Motion Picture Publicists Union, the people that make the ads for the movies, Hollywood, or Paramount, United Artists. And he was a communist. I found his communist membership card in the basement when I was 11. And then the FBI came and knocked on the door when I was 14, so I got to answer the door to the FBI. Okay, after this massive history in the OSS in World War II, I mean, just doing unbelievable stuff with the Nazis. I mean, it was just like this crazy. Okay, so just know that there's a lot of crazy shit going on for decades. This is not new. All right, so that's grounding and helpful. I think it's fantastic that the younger generation is finally getting it, and it is about democracy. I mean, these big pieces are coming together, right? And the last thing I'm going to say is that my sign for the next demonstration, you know, our No Kings thing is, Donald, comma, you're not the boss of me.
Thanks. Questions for Jaz?
Well, first of all, my father's an entrepreneur. My sisters were entrepreneurs, and we married entrepreneurs. But when I worked in television, it wouldn't have worked if it wasn't protected by the union, because only people would be apprentices, you know, who could afford other people. And then I went to New York City Cab Drivers Union, which was an absolute joke. We thought of it as an entertainment tax because, you know, they're more concerned about Albania. Anyway, so my question to you is, I have two, but I'll only ask one now. How does somebody thinking about unions, especially established unions, decide which are the good ones and which are the not so good ones?
Great question.
Thank you.
I think a lot of unions, you know, contain multitudes and contain both good ones and not so good ones in the same organization. And, you know, despite sometimes banging your head into a wall, I think the best way to change a union is to organize a bunch of people into it. There's been this whole history of leftists who've decided to get jobs in unionized workplaces and try to change the labor movement that way. But unfortunately, as Richard mentioned, our union density in the U.S. is 5.9%. And so we have 93% of workers in the U.S. who don't have any union representation at all. And a union, unlike a company, has democratic mechanisms. Sometimes they're not as good as we would like them to be, but there's ways to organize. And I think, you know, especially around Palestine and some of the things that have been very controversial within the labor movement itself, there's been this idea of like, oh my God, the workers are going to organize against us, the leadership of the union. And I think that's fantastic. Like workers should be organizing and demanding things of the union, but also organizing the unorganized workers to fight the boss and try to build power. And that will start, the culture of Workers United is different as a result of Starbucks Workers United, like zero question about that. So the way that you change what a union's priorities are is by bringing all of these new workers who bring, new voice and new perspective into the labor movement, but also, changing society by raising union density, which is the true fight we should be having.
Next question.
Jaz, do you have any connection to and think there's much potential for the recent last 10 years, say, collaborations between unions and employee ownership?
Great question. And there's two sides of this question, I think, which can both be told in the story of Gimme Coffee in Ithaca, New York. And so I think employee ownership, is at its best like the ultimate ideal of the labor movement. Instead of being a quote unquote counterbalance to capitalism, unions can be the means of workers truly operating the means of production and truly having workplace democracy. I'm a big fan of Georges Sorel's essay, The Socialist Future of the Syndicates, which is basically like organizing a union isn't going to overthrow capitalism today, but if we teach people, how to be the administrators of all of these societal functions and functions of, the corporations that they're running, then that's how we build up, the new world within the shell of the old. But I think at Gimme Coffee, what we saw was a very weird capitalist perversion of this, where the owner was like, okay, I want to become a co-op. I'm going to set the price of my own business. And we're so woke that you don't need a union. You should decertify your union and become a worker co-op. And so they did decertify the union temporarily. There was a long legal battle. The company, the owner set the price of the business and saddled the new co-op with all of this debt. And by the time the union got back in, workers had not had any say in how this co-op structure would be set up. The buy-in price was really high, and so like people couldn't even afford to be worker owners. Whereas had it been a collaborative process, it could have been a really great model. And we have a friend who advised us on Gimme named Ray Crisatello, who's a genius of organizing unionized worker co-ops. She's absolutely brilliant and a huge mentor for me on that.
So we got 10 minutes left, so another question?
Yeah. What is the biggest difference between organizing, for example, people on a factory floor and organizing medical doctors, for example, at hospitals?
I'll let you take that because I have not done healthcare organizing.
I don't know. I think I have a contrarian answer. I think all organizing is very similar. I've organized doctors. I've organized factory workers. It's the same threats made to everybody. It's a threatening atmosphere where your job and your livelihood is threatened. You would think there's a different playbook. There really isn't. Same for university professors. It's a very similar playbook.
One thing I would add is people always thought it was much easier to organize at a Starbucks because it's a very small workplace. And certainly there's advantages of like being able to have one inside organizer or SALT, get to know everybody. But there's downsides to this too, including if you have corporate send 10 managers to your store, which they did in many cases, and they succeed in flipping a handful of people, then you can go from winning to losing much more quickly than you can in a much bigger unit. So I think, like you're saying, organizing has its obstacles no matter what the scale is or what the context is.
Yeah. One pitch for this book is I've never met a better organizer in any line of political work, and I've never met a better writer. So you had an unusual combination of two things in one. But what I find interesting is not about your background. We interview people at iOS, what's your background, to get a sense. So my dad's a labor lawyer, whatever it is. My grandmother worked for the ILG and organized garment workers in New York City. Your background, just a minute, but your background, it doesn't fit anything I've ever seen. And how were you reading Eugene Debs when you were 15?
Well, I was homeschooled, and I do not recommend being homeschooled. But the one thing that it did offer was a lot of time to read and develop special interests. And so labor history became my special interest. And it was really the rabbit hole of Clarence Darrow into Eugene Debs, but then I got really into Joe Hill and, the history of the Wobblies. Until I met you, that was kind of where my knowledge of the labor movement began and ended. But Jenny.
One question.
Well, or you can ask it.
Okay.
One last question.
It's time.
You have 7 minutes. You can have a dialogue.
No, listen, this is very inspiring, wonderful to hear you. Can you tell us what is the current status of the Starbucks campaign, since you were the person who sort of launched it several years ago? And then secondly, what should people do who want to be part of the labor movement?
Current status of the Starbucks campaign is a loaded question. I think, there were always different camps. In the beginning of the Starbucks campaign, it was just, this little undertaking of this little region of Workers United in Buffalo, New York. And everybody was like, good luck, you'll never win. Starbucks is too big and too hard. And, store-by-store elections aren't going to get anywhere. And have fun.
No national union would fund it. Only there's one person we found.
So at that time, there weren't a lot of schools of thought because the schools of thought were, haha, good luck, or we can do this. And, I was really optimistic, I think, about our ability to win because we had to. And I'm a huge fan of James Connolly, who was a Wobbly and an Irish revolutionary, and he wrote this poem in response to people who would tell him to be moderate, which was, but we are moderate, we only want the earth. So that was one school of thought. But as the campaign got bigger and became national, more players started to want credit and control for parts of the campaign. And I get into this more in the book. But there were different strategies about what we should do, what we should not do. And one of those big there were two main divides around the issues of boycotting and bargaining. And Richard and I had worked on Spot Coffee in Buffalo, where a company that was union busting the hell out of workers and firing people and doing all the unethical things that companies can do, went from that to being we now believe in social justice and please come back to our business in a matter of a few weeks as a result of a community boycott that cost them at least 40% of their business. And so that was what we thought we were going to do at Starbucks was we thought it was important to go to the first election and win the right to organize and to prove that workers wanted to unionize in order to, rally public opinion around this fight and try to win the right to organize. But we always thought that would take a consumer boycott. The other divide was around whether we should have bargaining at all of the stores all at once and try to drive Starbucks crazy by making them fly their corporate execs and their union busting Littler Mendelsohn lawyers around. And we were, pro boycott and pro let's, have people have the experiences of workplace democracy, even if the company's not interested in bargaining in good faith. The national union was much more interested in, how are we going to control things if we let all these people bargain and, we can't do a boycott because that's not democratic enough, or we can't guarantee that would win. And I think, when we had the Palestine stuff and Howard Schultz lost his mind, we did have a grassroots global boycott that cost Starbucks $11 billion in a couple of weeks of their market share. And we never had picket captains enforcing that. That was social media and word of mouth and, global pressure on the company. But I think that proved, Starbucks, the only thing that Starbucks might eventually pay attention to was something that was hitting them in the pocketbook. Where is the campaign now? Campaign now is much more in the hands of the centralized folks. Bargaining is still slogging on, but I think it remains to be seen. There's still a lot of amazing rank and file Starbucks workers that we've been working with from the beginning of the campaign who I think have the ability to start steering it in a better direction. But if folks want to get involved in the labor movement, I think everybody should have the experience of organizing their own workplace and ideally, being part of a campaign that, has the strategy and the potential to truly transform things. And so that's where the Inside Organizer School comes in. We do trainings all around the country and we help connect young folks who are interested in getting involved with union campaigns where they can make a real difference. And so would love to talk more about that afterwards. We're still trying to expand geographically. We're fundraising to try to make this more of a reality and bring on more folks to help with recruitment. Would love to talk to anybody interested in salting.
So we have are we done? We have 2 minutes.
Assault is somebody who gets a job with the goal of organizing it. So inside organizer, SALT, all interchangeable, but somebody who's getting a job and helping unionize as a worker.
So
Yes.
So we have time for one final question to Jaz. Anybody want to do it? Barbara, you have a good one? I can't think of a good one. Let's see. Why won't you wear this is your last chance to wear the apron, Jaz. I mean, we for a photo op.
It's a coffee cup lid.
It says get on the job and organize.
I wanted to put the picture that is on the back cover on the front cover, which is Casey Moore, my incredible coworker. The proudest thing that I've done is recruit Casey to move to Buffalo and get a job at Starbucks. And we thought that she would be moving to Buffalo for 3 months. 3 years later, she's running the organizing program up there and is my main co-conspirator on the Inside Organizer School. So.
Gary Bonadonna was the only labor leader I talked to. I talked to a million unions about funding a Starbucks campaign or any big restaurant. He was the only one. This one little union up in Rochester, Buffalo, New York, was the one person that had the courage to take a risk on all of us. So.
I really want to thank all of you for coming, but especially Jaz and Richard, and bringing forward an understanding to an issue that many of us really don't have a lot of familiarity with. Now, Jaz will be going to the author signing tent, and you can go over to the Bunch of Grapes books tent and buy their book, and keep this support the author and support the author event here. So thank you all very much for coming. We appreciate it, and it's been a pleasure to listen to you today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.